This week on Act Out, here's what climate refugees need to make it through a disaster. How would you fare? Next up, how the government shutdown targets survivors of domestic and sexual violence, plus the age-old story of colonial oppression gets a reboot via an outgoing representative's bill block. Finally, Elizabeth Vega joins us to talk about the Tornillo occupation and how to address the rise of imprisoned migrant children and families. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. An orange flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. A late December post by The Intercept reports that tens of thousands of U.S. residents were displaced by climate change-fueled disasters in 2018. Record-breaking fires, hurricanes, and floods battered and beat people who, by our system's own design, were already trying to balance on the cracked, unstable foundation of capitalism, where those who carry the heaviest loads have the least and are asked to give the most. And when disaster hits, there is no safety net to fall into. Not for us. The survivors of disasters have resorted to camping in tents and retail parking lots, sleeping on friends' couches, parking trailers on the lawns of their destroyed homes, or renting overpriced apartments in communities where housing has become increasingly scarce. A climate refugee's pathway to recovery is determined by their savings, family wealth, community connections, and credit scores. Now, according to 2017 numbers, roughly 57% of Americans have less than $1,000 in their savings accounts, and some 39% don't have a savings account. This means that the vast majority of us are or would be absolutely screwed if and when a disaster hits. Former guest of our show, homelessness activist and artist Aaron Draper, put it pretty pointedly when he said that we are all just one disaster away from being those people on the street that we never even deign to interact with. And when it comes to family wealth, shit. As we've reported before, a full 43% of Americans can't pay for basics like rent and food. And according to 2015 numbers, spoiler alert, the past 3 years have not been kind, the average income for the bottom 90% of the country was just above $34,000. So talking about U.S. family wealth is about as sensical as talking about a compassionate conservative or a logical liberal. There might be one or two in there, but they're really the exception that proves the really shitty rule. And when it comes to community connections, an important distinction needs to be made, because experience proves that big nonprofits and state-affiliated entities are out for personal gain and clean aesthetics, two things that clash very harshly with the realities of disaster relief and grassroots solidarity. For instance, in mid-December, a large tent city in a church parking lot in Panama City, Florida was demolished by order of local law enforcement and with the help of a big nonprofit. While temperatures hovered in the 30s on the morning of December 11th, 6 police cars arrived and spoke with members of the United Methodist Committee on Relief, or UMCOR, while unaffiliated volunteers served coffee to some of the hundreds of people who were living in the makeshift refugee camp. Shortly thereafter, loudspeaker warnings rang out, telling residents that they had 3 hours to pack up all of their belongings and leave the premises or they'd be arrested. The Panama City mayor backed the eviction, saying this cannot exist. But it did exist, and it existed because it had to. Folks with nowhere to go after Hurricane Michael destroyed their homes had cobbled together a survival in the Forest Park Methodist Church parking lot. A few weeks later, UMCOR reps arrived and made hefty promises about the aid that they were going to manifest. Yet when the moment arrived for UMCOR to really step up and resist state-sponsored violence and human rights abuses, they caved. This international nonprofit with $100 million plus in assets opted instead to offer $10 bus tickets to a shelter in Pensacola. Those who didn't accept could either stay and get arrested or disperse. No one knows where, who cares, just not there. And so, Panama City residents had 3 hours to collect the last of their belongings before having to stand by and watch as their only remaining semblance of a home was destroyed. And those who weren't there at the time came back to find that another shitstorm had upended their lives. And in this case, the storm was nonprofit and state collusion, which serves and protects the wealth, interests, and image of the ruling elite. In short, our system seeks to ensure that folks can neither depend on their own finances nor the finances of big nonprofits to save them in the ever more likely event of a life-shattering disaster. This cannot exist. It cannot sustain. And it's already crumbling. And as it crumbles, we have to deliberately build alternatives to address these disasters. Groups like Mutual Aid Disaster Relief, who I've had on the show before and who assisted on the ground in Panama City, are examples of how solidarity rather than capitalist charity really serve the people. And as we move into the new year, we should all be thinking about how we can facilitate people-powered safety nets, how we can start filling in the gaping chasms left by the system, so that we are prepared not only for the disasters of a changing climate, but for all of the disasters that go with late-stage capitalism. On the subject of late-stage disasters, on December 22nd, Senator Warren summed up some dangerously depressing news. The Violence Against Women Act, which supports critical programs to help victims of sexual assault, domestic abuse, and stalking, expired at midnight. We could have funded it, but Trump would rather shut down the government for a wall that doesn't make us any safer. Although I'm not a big fan of Warren's, this tweet is basically the gist of the shitstorm we still face as of the taping of this show when the government is still shut down. The Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, pays for crucial programs that assist survivors of domestic and sexual violence. From legal advocacy to medical exams to educational programs to safe housing to special consideration for undocumented, Native, LGBTQ, and other marginalized groups, VAWA provided funding for some of the only resources that survivors have in this system. The deadline originally loomed way back in September, when a 5-year renewal came up for a vote. However, lawmakers kicked that can to December 7th and then again to December 21st. By the 22nd, our government shut down due to a stalemate over Trump's beloved border wall, sending countless programs and workers into financial freefall. With regards to VAWA, many of those who depend on grants work in a schedule of reimbursement, so right now, they're paying out what should be reimbursed at the end of January, a scary position to find yourself in as one looks on at our gross inefficiencies. As it stands right now, the current extension of VAWA would really only last till February 8th. That is, if the proposed funding package clears the Orange Troll's desk. And this extension would not even include proposed changes, which, quote, would have expanded protections to Native American tribes, kept convicted domestic abusers and stalkers from having legal access to firearms, expanded economic security and housing opportunities to survivors of domestic violence, and created more education and prevention programs. Because homeless Indigenous sexual assault survivors being stalked by white men with guns and cowboy hats is what makes America great. Indeed, a single white man managed to block an entire bill intended to improve the federal government's response to violence against Native American women. Before leaving office, Bob Goodlatte, chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, refused to bring Savannah's Act up for a vote because he objected to the idea of giving Indigenous women preferential treatment in enforcement policy. The problem, as we've discussed on this show before, is of course that Indigenous women and girls face preferential violence on a scale that surpasses any other demographic. According to the recent National Institute of Justice report released in May 2016, research shows that 4 in 5 Native women, 84.3%, will experience violence in their lifetime. More than half of Native women, 56%, have experienced sexual violence. Native women are 2.5 times more likely to experience rape than other women in the nation. These numbers are staggering, and yet they're incomplete. As we've noted on this show before as well, there's no comprehensive database to deal with missing or murdered Indigenous women. Furthermore, there are horrendous legal restrictions on investigating, prosecuting, and punishing crimes against Indigenous women and girls. Savannah's Act, sponsored by previous Senator Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota, would improve tribal access to federal databases for tracking missing tribal persons. It would require the Department of Justice to consult with tribes while developing guidelines mandate reporting statistics regarding missing and murdered Native Americans to Congress and streamlined coordination between tribes and law enforcement agencies with training and technical assistance in putting the guidelines in force. Goodlatte took issue with the law enforcement guidelines in particular, meaning that, he's not necessarily against the idea of documenting this extreme violence. He's really just against the idea of doing anything about it. And people say colonialist violence is dead. And as we zoom out from that particular issue and back to the broader Violence Against Women Act, we see the familiar old, white, crotchety faces of men who have absolutely no interest in the physical, emotional, or mental well-being of the majority of people in this country. Women, LGBTQ, immigrants, indigenous, or otherwise marginalized communities. The patriarchal white supremacy is glaring. And it manifests in all walks of life, from the floor of Congress to Indian country to our very own concentration camps. As 2018 came to a close, activists, organizers occupied and held space outside of the Tornillo Youth Detention Center, a glorified prison operated by Baptist Child and Family Services in Tornillo, Texas. Using artful tactics and direct action, activists called attention to the imprisonment of migrant children and the horrific separation of families at the border, while making contact with both imprisoned children and prison workers. Last week, we talked with organizer Elizabeth Vega, co-founder of Artivists St. Louis and founder of Art House, about the situation at Tornillo, the occupation, and the road ahead.
There is this concentration camp in the middle of the desert that's holding 3,000 brown children in an area that is, overwhelmingly brown folks. And so the fight takes on a lot of complexities and layers because we have brown folks that are working in the camp because the area is very impoverished and they're paying living wages and top dollar. And it's isolated, but it's also, smack dab between El Paso and Tornillo. So it seemed like an area that we really needed to really make it a brown-led resistance because there's so much work to be done. And I think also seeing the accumulation of how the system has changed the area, how the border has become militarized and political. I mean, when I was growing up, we would cross over regularly to go to El Paso with, from El Paso to Juarez, no problem at all. There was just a steady flow. The same for Palomas, which is over by where Deming is. There was just movement. People just moved back and forth. Sometimes people from the United States would go to the doctor in Mexico because they could get cheaper meds. Sometimes kids whose parents, were from Mexico but who were American citizens would come and go to U.S. schools, and there was always that free flow. And then, it started to get militarized, and now the entire area is on lockdown. There is no way to go through El Paso unless you go through a checkpoint. Like, you could get into El Paso, but you can't go out unless there's a checkpoint. So what has been happening with the kids in Tornillo is they are often considered the unaccompanied minors. And so, but they define that very loosely. Like, if you have somebody that is coming, say, with an aunt or an uncle or a sibling, they will consider them an unaccompanied minor because they aren't with their parents. And then that would be a reason for them to be in Tornillo. But then what they started doing probably around July or August is these real draconian measures where they were using the children as bait. And so anybody who was in the Tornillo the Tornillo concentration camp, when parents tried to claim their child, they would tell them that they needed to fingerprint anybody who was going to have contact with that child. And then they started deporting those who did not have their documentation. Mm-hmm. And so parents were put in the wrenching position of having to choose between getting their child out of the concentration camp or having family members deported. Mm-hmm. And so then it also lengthened the process. So some of the kids have been there over 190 days. Some of them are, going on 200 days. And they were only supposed to be there temporarily. And, the camp was supposed to shrink in size. Instead, it's quadrupled.
And with regards to your actions, you set up a water blockade with water jugs, which is, of course, a clear nod to the grotesque practice where Border Patrol destroys water jugs left out for migrants who travel across the desert nearly dying of thirst. Talk about the importance of highlighting the water issue, not just for Tornillo, but beyond.
Well, I think that the thing is that we are at a place in this country where even the basic necessity of water has become a weapon of oppression. Even that has become militarized in many ways. You have what's happening in Flint, Michigan, where drinking water, folks in Flint, Michigan have contaminated water pipes and are still having to have water bottles shipped in. You have the Standing Rock struggle where people are fighting the pipelines for water, for clean water. You have children that are coming out of the detention, the family detention centers that are dehydrated and parched because they were not given water in these detention centers. We talked to one mother who begged them to give her water because her milk was drying up and they would not give her water. She had to sneak in water so that her milk wouldn't dry up so that she could feed her baby. This is a basic human right. Now, we have heard that water is going to be the next, quote, oil, right? It's going to be the next. I think that we need to get ahead of this right now because it's all connected and it's all rooted in our humanity and seeing one another's humanity and seeing the importance of water as being sacred and how it's linked to the sacredness of our life. And so that's part of the reason why we wanted to do that. People should not be put in prison for giving humanitarian aid and water to people. Mm-hmm. Children should not be held in family detention centers and denied water. We talked to somebody who said that at a detention center in Albuquerque for trans folks, that they were being forced to drink water out of the back of the toilet.
And I want to talk a little bit more about that blockade because it happened during a shift change. Were you able to make contact with any of the workers? You mentioned that a lot of the workers are brown. Were you able to make contact? Was there any sort of response from the workers?
Most of the workers stayed on the bus, but there were some actions that were directed specifically to the workers. And I want to clarify, we had a young activist. She's only like 15. And she went with people and she followed the buses. And she's Black. And she was dismayed when she realized that it was Black and brown folks mostly that were working that camp. And and so that ties into poverty issues. Mm-hmm. Because who are the most economically disadvantaged in this country? Because they're using people of color to oppress other people of color. It's a white supremacy tactic as old as the hills. Mm-hmm. And that's why we need to call it, we need to name it, and we need to understand the interlocking components of these movements. Because if they can pay living wages for a concentration camp, they can pay a living wage every other place.
Was there any sort of contact with the children that were inside?
We had big, giant puppets that popped over the fence that could be seen over the fence. We had a professional stilt walker that popped up over the fence. We threw soccer balls up over the fence, and the kids saw us. They would cheer. They would raise their hands. Every time they acknowledged us, the staff would usher them back inside. They did not want people to have contact with them, nor did they want us to have contact with the children. And my thing is if you have nothing to hide, if this is so well run, then why is it behind barbed wire and fencing? And why are you covering the fence with black plastic tarps? I mean, we did a lot of different tactics. Like I said, we did resistance around the area. We went around towards the back. We held up banners. We chanted. We had sticks with big ribbons on them that we could hand up and that were bright and colorful against the sky. Joyful, whimsical resistance. We had people from all across the country make 3,000 tissue paper flowers, like help us make 3,000 tissue paper flowers, and the whole encampment has paper flowers all around it so that we can point to each of those flowers and say, see that? Each one of those flowers represents a child that's in there.
Mm.
Because it's like, how do you show the magnitude of 3,000 children?
Right.
Especially when they're behind barbed wire.
So what's the next steps in terms of, do you have any idea what's going to happen with these kids? Is there just sort of this open-ended, indefinite feel to it?
It has this open-end, indefinite feel to it. They were supposed to close it in I think June or July. Then they were supposed to close it the end of the year. And then they were supposed to close it in January. And now we're hearing June or July again. And I think like what they keep doing is they keep kicking the ball down the road and people get complacent. We expect them to close the Tornillo camp down and all the detention centers where these families and children are being held, but not in the way that they have been. Experience has taught us that they plan to do it. Like they did in El Paso this past week, where they were dropping hundreds of people off at parks, at bus stations, at other places in the city, and just saying, here, you handle this. You had volunteers that were running, starting and running 24-hour emergency shelters because they had just released people. Some of them still had their anklet monitors on. No explanation given to them what they were supposed to do with that. With no resources. And saying, find your way to your sponsor. Mm. That's cruelty.
Yeah.
And so we want them to be intentional and compassionate and methodical and humane. Part of the accountability is that we, as a country, if we truly say that we believe in humanitarian care, if we pride ourselves in being a supposed leader and, a superpower, then we absolutely need to rise up as people and insist that our government do the right thing. And if that means us going out into the streets and protesting and having a presence at every single detention camp and detention center in this country to do that, that's what we need to do. Because what we saw this past week was just simply unacceptable. And it is a humanitarian crisis, and our complacency is fueling that. And we need a brown-led resistance, particularly at the camp at Tornillo, because of all the issues that are connected, that are manifested in that camp, are a brown and an indigenous struggle. And so we want there to be resistance and a brown-led resistance. We invite everybody to come, all colors, all backgrounds, but let it be known that it will be a brown-led resistance. Mm. And, that brown leadership will be followed, because those are the folks that have been dealing with all of the issues for years, long before the concentration camp at Tornillo showed up. I think we need resistance at every detention center in this country. We need people to show up and be there and insist that our country do the right thing. So if we have an occupation at Tornillo, we have one at Florida, we have another one at the detention centers in Arizona, that every single detention center should have people rising up and say, this will not stand. Because what is happening is a crime, multiple crimes against humanity.
To stay up to date on Tornillo, the occupation, visit their Facebook page at facebook.com/creative-brown-resistance. Also, to hear the full interview with Elizabeth, check out the Act Out podcast, which comes out every Friday on Libsyn, Stitcher, Spotify, and iTunes. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Happy New Year, and thank you so much for watching. Please do spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people that you don't know. Again, check out that last slide and the show description to find sites that we mentioned in this week's show. And please, 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 please sign up for our newsletter. It is the best way to stay up to date on all of the things that we talk about on this show and off. And to those who have donated, thank you so much. Please keep spreading the word in order to ensure our ability to keep acting out. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left for nothing, motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been begging up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since your push to serve my shove. I'm not a violent man, but I will kill for what I love.